So Eileen Gray was born Kathleen Eileen Moray in 1878 in Ireland, near Enniscorthy, which is in the county Wexford. And Queen Victoria is on the throne still, so she's you know a, a bit before some of her Bauhaus peers. And so she is Irish, and her mother comes from a very distinguished lineage. And it was quite a scandal when the mother married the father, who was a painter and a free spirit, and seldom at home and often traveling to Italy. And Eileen would accompany him, and I think she got her sort of a lot of her independent creative spirit from him. And when she's 10 years old, her older sister, Ethel, marries an aristocrat by the name of Henry Tufnell Campbell. And Henry is a snob, and he's very pretentious, and Eileen really detests him. Um, and it's Henry that Henry, the brother-in-law, that convinces Eileen's mother, Eveline, to claim a royal title. So she goes to like the House of Lords and applies to be a baroness, which she inherits that title upon the death of an uncle in 1893. And she's granted that title, so she becomes Baroness Grey, and the surname of all the family changes to Grey. And so Eileen actually has a royal title. Her title is Eileen the Honorable, so detests and will never use. And this was the original manor on the left-hand side. This is Brownswood Manor. And upon receiving this royal title, and upon Henry's insistence, the manor is remodeled, and it's changed from this very simple manor to this Elizabethan Victorian gingerbread giant house, which Eileen really detested. And I think this destruction of her childhood home sort of drove her away from her family. And she kept these photos all of her life, which I think is very telling because she actually destroyed a lot of her correspondence later in life. And so to an architectural student decades later, she wrote, "As a child, I loved the old Irish house that was pulled down in 1895 or earlier, and a horrible brick structure built in its place, so I went to go live in France." And so Eileen's mother spends her time between London and Ireland, and in the year 1900, they go to visit Paris, which is Eileen's first time for the Universal Exhibition, which is sort of like a celebration of the past century and this look towards new technology of the new century, the 20th century. And I think this is like the debut of an escalator, and the Grand Palais makes its debut, and there's all these pavilions for different countries nestled at the bottom of the Eiffel Tower. So this is what that looked like, and including the Japanese pavilion, which will come into play in a little while. And immediately the idea of returning to Paris appeals to Eileen. In the same year in 1900, Eileen's brother dies in South Africa from drinking poisoned water, and also her father dies in the same year. She's 21 years old at this point, and usually a woman of 21 years would use marriage as sort of like her escape. But Eileen was quite independent, and I don't think marriage was in the cards for her. And she asks her mother if she can enroll in the Slade School of Art in London. And her mother agrees, and so Eileen goes to art school in London. This is the only surviving sketch of hers from that time. And museum trips are encouraged quite a bit. And she goes to the South Kensington Museum, which is now the Victoria and Albert Museum. And this is her first introduction to lacquer work. In 1902, she convinces two friends that are both at the Slade School to leave for Paris and to attend a different school, the École Colarossi. And by the way, I didn't denote that I do not speak French, and I will absolutely butcher every French word, which there's quite a few. So Eileen's mother grants her permission to go to Paris. She has to return in 1905 to England to take care of her mother, who has fallen ill. And while she's in London, she comes across a lacquer repair shop by a Mr. D. Charles, as the proprietor of this lacquer shop. And she asks if she can work there for a few weeks. And she's watching and helping the two work. And upon returning to Paris, she meets a young penniless Japanese student in his 20s named Saizo Sugawara. And this is him on the right-hand side. And he had come to Paris to repair the screens for that Japanese pavilion. He comes from a northern village called Johoji in Japan that's known for its lacquer work. and he stayed in Paris. He loved the city, and he never left. So Eileen employs him for a few years, and Sugawara teaches Eileen the ancient ways of lacquer, which is a really painstaking process. These are her tools. It requires 20 coats of lacquer, and using the sap of a lacquer tree, which is poisonous to touch, until it dries. So Eileen develops a lacquer disease, which is a rat for arms, and just persists with the material until you become immune to it eventually. In 1907, Eileen moved to the Rue Bonaparte, and she asked for an increased allowance from her mother, which was granted. And she never left this apartment for 70 years. And after moving in, she feverishly takes to mastering lacquer with Sugawara. And lacquer has to dry in a humid environment. So she has all of the bathroom faucets on, running all night, and the kitchen faucets to dry in a humid atmosphere. They begin employing a cabinet maker to make large wooden panels. So lacquer masters at this point are really focusing on small objects, and then she's starting to focus on very large panels. Lacquer work is slow and painstaking and only turns out a few very expensive pieces, which are often sold at cost. This is her first large screen panel called La Voie Lactée, the Milky Way. So you can see this is a nude figure running across a landscape, and the hair is turning into the Milky Way galaxy. Today, this piece is lost and only the photograph remains, and it was originally supposed to be blue, but she wasn't happy with the color. She is experimenting continually with color and writing back to her first mentor, Mr. D. Charles in London, asking about making blue. And she is repeatedly told that it's impossible, that green will always dominate. And she continues experimenting and actually perfects a blue lacquer using a new chemical substance that she won't reveal. So she's the first one to pioneer a real, true blue lacquer. And in 1913, she presents this screen called Le Magicien de la Nuit, the Magician of the Night, at an exhibition in Paris. And 3 future clients are introduced to her work on this occasion. And one of those is Jacques Doucet, who's on the left, and he is the couturier and the king of French fashion at that point in time. And he's a collector of fine and rare items. And a few days after the exhibition, he turns up at Eileen's apartment on the Rue Bonaparte, and she's just putting the final touches on this screen on the right-hand side. That's called Le Destin, and it's these sort of Romanesque or Art Nouveau-ish figures that are carrying a shrouded figure away. And Doucet purchases this screen from her for the equivalent of $300, which is 1,500 francs at the time. And he insists that she sign it. And so this is the only piece of work that actually bears her signature. And then from there, he actually commissions her to create some furniture, some lacquered furniture. So these are a few of those items. This is sort of a marine motif on the left with seahorses and a fishnet. And then on the right, a table called Bilboquet, which is like the little game with a cup and a ball when you're a kid. This is a lotus table, which features 4 tassels and balls of amber. And she saw this probably 50 years later at an exhibition, and she said, if I had a pair of scissors, I would run over there and cut those tassels off. She hated seeing this much later in life. And Eileen's lacquer work gains popularity, and this is she was featured in an article of British Vogue in 1917, and this is actually where that photo of the Milky Way panels come from. Around 1909, her interests turn elsewhere, and she becomes very interested in rug making. And she takes a trip to Morocco with her friend Evelyn, and takes very meticulous notes on dyes and making certain colors and knots and weaving. And these are a few of those samples. So in her lacquer work, she's trying to free herself from the organic influence of Art Nouveau. And then when she's really getting into her rug, she's moving towards geometric abstraction. And a lot of the time there's paintings and gouache, like on the left-hand side, that are then translated into weaving on the right-hand side. She employs a few women in a workshop in Paris, and they start weaving rugs. This is a rug called Saint-Tropez that I have on display in the showroom. July 23rd, 1914, Austria declares war on Serbia, um, and the Germans declare on war on Russia, and World War I begins. There's a very austere atmosphere in Paris, and sort of the hatred of the German aggressor. And there's a suspicion of foreigners, and she's not French, she's Irish, so she is very much a foreigner. So it's sort of like you have to prove your allegiance. And so she, with two friends, drives a sort of makeshift ambulance, taking wounded soldiers from a train station to sort of makeshift hospitals, and does this for roughly a year. In 1915, a year later, she decides there's enough women driving ambulances, and takes Sugawara, returns to London, take as many tools and unfinished works as possible. But by the British Vogue article, British taste does not favor her. She can't sell a single piece. There's shortages of food due to blockades. There's blackout and constant Zeppelin raids, and she is pretty miserable and lonely, and decides that it's better to be back in Paris, and returns to Paris with Sugawara in the middle of the war still. In 1918, the armistice is signed. In 1919, her mother dies. She returns to Ireland for the funeral. After the war, people want to forget about all that austerity, and there's this period of lavish excess that follows. And hopefully this, something similar in this current situation, perhaps some pent-up demand, hopefully. And styles like Cubism and Futurism are beginning to flourish in the 1920s, and a new style called Art Deco replaces Art Nouveau, and people begin to remember the young girl who was doing lacquer work before the war. And an acquaintance of Jacques Doucet is this lady, Madame Mathieu Levy, and she is the milliner, a very wealthy milliner of a salon called Suzanne Talbot's. So if you recall Talbot's clothing stores. And she hires Eileen to redo her flat on the Rue de Lota. And this is the first time that Eileen is no longer really limited to objects, but she's hired as an interior designer to make an environment, a space. So this is the entrance of that apartment. And Eileen is really focused on entrances as well. There's a quote later that an entrance should be like a mouth closing behind you. She sort of wants to like compress your view, and then you have a release to get into the main space, I suppose. So this is the first, these lacquered bricks. So this is 450 lacquered bricks that she and Sugawara made, and employed several other people to feverishly make these. So each one has 20 coats of lacquer on it, and they're sort of folding off of the walls and becoming, turning into an independent screen as you reach the door there. So it's sort of impossible to distinguish where the architecture stops and where the object begins, which I think is very telling with a lot of her environments and work. This is a sofa called the pirogue chaise. This is inspired by Polynesian canoes. She made a few of these around that time. And this is the salon with these lacquered panels in the background. So everything down to the little base of that Egyptian statue is lacquered. And this is around the same time as like the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, and that's certainly not lost on her. There's sort of this Egyptian craze at the time as well that's quite fashionable. The space was redesigned a couple of years later in 1924 by a different designer called Paul Rurad. And he changes the floor to be this sort of like disco glass floor that would light up actually. But they bring Eileen on to make some new furniture pieces, and we're going to see a couple of important pieces now. One of which is the serpent's armchair, or the dragon's armchair, which is on the back left-hand side, and also the bibendum armchair, which is on the far left, and then again on the right. So this is the armchair, dragon's armchair, that originally would have been in a pale salmon color fabric. And this is the bibendum chair, which is named after the Michelin Man. And this is actually an advertisement around the turn of the century for Michelin. And Nunc est bibendum at the top, which translates to now is the time for drinking. So bibendum in Latin means drink. And this is an 1898 poster that is, it's like his scrawny competitors towards on either side of him. And this is saying, here's to your health, Michelin tire drinks up the obstacles. And the implication is that Michelin tires will easily take on road hazards. And the company uses this format for 15 or 20 years. And at some point, sorry, at some point, his name becomes Bibendum. In 1922, Eileen begins a love affair with a singer, a nightclub singer, an opera singer, and her name is Damia. So Eileen is bisexual. Um, and this is sort of Eileen's foray into the frivolous social world of Paris at the time. And I actually found a recording of Damia singing. So this is, here we go.
Les marins qui meurent en mer et que l'on jette au gouffre amer comme une pierre, avec les chrétiens refroidis, ne s'en vont pas au paradis trouver Saint-Pierre.
There's a film called Napoleon. It's very, very long. It's 5 hours, I think, in many parts, and it's basically a silent film that's been like dubbed over with music. And she was singing part of that. So Eileen bobs her hair. She buys stunning evening coats and dresses from Lanvin, and attends nightclubs and fashionable restaurants. Damia would often be over to Eileen's apartment on the Rue Bonaparte, and they had a pet panther. So if you can imagine them driving around Paris in a convertible with a panther in the back seat, maybe appropriate right now with Tiger King getting all the rage. So Damia prompted Eileen to try designing for a ballet, and through Damia, Eileen met and occasionally socialized with Natalie Barney and Gertrude Stein, the sort of group of power lesbians at the time in the 1920s in Paris. And Damia takes Eileen out of her self-imposed solitude, and I think Eileen gives Damia some stability that she lacked in her lifestyle. Eileen teaches Damia how to clean lacquer and made some pieces for her, including this chair on the right-hand side that's Siren's armchair, which is the siren from the Odyssey from Homer. So it's a siren sort of nestling. I think I actually can't see it with the screen, but I think it's a seahorse if I recall correctly. And so all of her life, she keeps the records and photos and dresses associated with Damia. Eventually, their love affair waned, and I think Eileen tires of lifestyle. Damia is already living with someone else. In 1921, while still working on the Rue de Loda flat, Eileen decides to expand her business. So custom rugs are not so economical, and Eileen doesn't love having clients at her house all the time. She looks for a suitable space for a shop and finds a place in the fashionable Faubourg Saint-Honoré district. And so she opens a showroom for herself that's called Jean Dessert. She had just met a young gentleman named Jean, who we'll see again in a moment. And she thought that her business would be taken more seriously if it were named after a man. And Dessert from her trip to Morocco, from the desert. And so she had actually designed these 3 white lacquered doors. She'd redone on this very traditional, at the top of this are like stucco lions on the same street. So I think it's quite a nice contrast. These are some still life photos that she had taken often at her showroom, Jean Dessert. And something that she's not really known for at all is painting, and something that she'll do throughout her life. Often some of these are to become rug designs, and sometimes they're just paintings on their own right. Who is also becomes a very well-known painter and actually is an integral part of the story later in her life. In 1923, she's asked to design the Salon des Artistes Décorateurs, and she builds this environment, including some steps and walls. And this is the first time that we're going to see the brick screen as independent screens, as freestanding objects. You have that central divan, which is sort of like a day bed, and she designs everything from the lamps to the rugs here. and she's diving into a world of modernism that echoes Cubism. The French press hated this and tore her apart, and she's quite sensitive and really took this to heart. And I think one of the critiques was Madame Gray for the Monte Carlo room was what this was called. For Monte Carlo, maddening with its chrysolite lamps and parchment and wrapping paper, it is the daughter of Caligari and all of its horrors. The most positive feedback came from Holland, from the dish still movement, and she writes to one of the Dutch reviewers that your country is the only one to understand me. This is that same space, and there's a note on the right-hand side from Eileen that says the coloring is wrong, that this should be silver and not gold. Around 1920, she meets John Badavici, who is likely who she named her showroom after. He's a young Romanian architect. He's 15 years her junior, and launches and is the editor of an architectural publication called L'Architecture Vivant, which is first published in 1923. And I think Eileen very much has her hand in this publication as well. And he encourages her to explore her hand at architecture. And it's said that the first time he suggests it, she laughs in his face. But she does, and she gives it a try. And this is her model for a house for an engineer in 1926. And with she had stayed in a hotel in Mexico. She went to Mexico twice in her life, and there's drawings of her redesigning the hotel room that she is staying in. And she would also she would sort of rip things out of periodicals, and was very much in the know about what was happening in Germany at the time, and would sort of redesign drawings that had been published by other people. Eileen is 46 years old when she begins architecture. So I think if any of us believe that it's too late to start something new, that this is a solid case against that. And in 1924, Badavici and Eileen, together with Eileen's resources, financial resources, began renovating a series of 6 connected stone homes in Vézelay, which is sort of an old pilgrimage town in central France. And Badavici takes the smallest apartment for himself. So these are like very small old homes with thick masonry walls, and essentially what they're doing is sort of like cutting out part of the floor plate to create double height sort of atrium spaces. So this will come into play later if you can sort of just keep in your mind the place with the pointy roofs. We'll visit this again in a little while. And through Badavici, Eileen is introduced to a number of people, including this gentleman on the left-hand side, Charles Edouard Jeanneret, who in 1919 had launched his own publication, Le Spirit Nouveau, and the following year in 1920 would adopt the pseudonym Le Corbusier. So I guess if you're quite familiar with design, that probably rings a bell already. I find it a little amusing that he's crossed out to editor on his card and written director instead. Le Corbusier had given to Eileen a set of his own drawings, which she experimented with and examined, and those would have included Villa-le-Lac, which is Corbusier's house for his own parents on Lake Geneva in Switzerland. And what's interesting here is it's one of his very early works, but he doesn't follow his own rules. So if you're familiar with Le Corbusier, he has his 5 points of architecture, and this is really an exception to his own rules that when he designed his own place for his parents. So one of those is pilotis, that the house should be raised up, and this one isn't. It's sitting on the ground. This is what the interior looked like of that house. And what's also interesting is that he had designed this sort of in a vacuum, like as a compositional space without any context. This didn't have a site. So he had designed this fully without knowing where the house was going to be built. There's a quote from him that says, "I boarded the Paris-Milan Express several times, or the Orient Express. In my pocket was the plan of a house. A plan without a site? The plan of a house in search of a plot of ground? Yes." He wrote in 1954. Eileen and Badavici were infatuated with each other, and the two had become lovers, and he asks her to build a little summer house, a little refuge in the south of France. Initially, she believes this is going to be in the peninsula of Saint-Tropez, which is where this photo was taken by Eileen. One day she drives as far as Roquebrune, which is on the coast between Menton and Nice, closer to the Italian border. She walks along a railroad track and comes across a rocky terrain 100 feet above the Mediterranean Mediterranean, which is very savage and unbuilt. And the only thing that exists is a vineyard and some lemon trees. Um, and she knew that she was going to build and going to build there. She calls Badavici, and he likes the site as well. And she purchases the site in his name. Important. And for 3 years, from 1926 to 1929, she lives on the site, lives nearby, and very seldom returns to Paris or to Vézelay. And so this is the design for that house, and the context is incredibly important. So you can actually see she's very much taking cues from the sun and sort of like the sun setting and rising. And the solid lines here are basically the circulation points for an inhabitant, and the dotted lines are the circulation lines for a servant for help. So she's, coming from a place of privilege and is used to having some help around, which is not uncommon, I guess, at this point in time. So you can see here that she's basically sort of nestled. So sort of nestling it into the lemon grove and keeping those trees on the front hand side. And upon completion, Gray and Badavici published the home in a special dedicated issue of L'Architecture Vivante. So the house is named E1027. So Maison en bord de mer is house on the sea. E1027 is sort of a cipher. It's a code. So E is for Eileen, 10 is for J, 2 is for B, 7 is for G. So it stands for their initials. It's E, J, B, G, Eileen, John, Badavici, Gray. This is the main entrance sort of from the train station. And this is similar to how the original coloring and layout would have looked. And Eileen demanded that the interior should really dictate the exterior of a space and not the other way around. There's sort of this mechanical ballet of everything is sort of like transforming, and you can drag these pieces out onto the terrace, and these concertina windows on the left-hand side are sort of accordion over and completely open to the terrace. And they actually had a patent on these folding concertina windows. And in France, they had essentially invented these, she and Badavici. Gray is also very playful and likes to have stencils and codes and little notes, I guess, around the house. So on the right-hand side, you can see there's a map of an island with invitation à voyage, invitation to travel, and there's it says beau temps, good weather, and I think there's a little note as well that says like attaboy toter, which is her car essentially, which is sort of just being playful because obviously a car is not going to take her to this island. But she's fascinated with travel and technology, and she's an early adopter of a car, actually. She gets an MG in 1902, I believe. This is that same central salon space. This is a lectern that sort of folds out of the wall, and sort of a blue film that can cover a light so that you can sort of choose the color of your light at the time. And there's a note that says pillows. So if you wanted to grab a pillow, you can just get into that compartment and grab yourself a pillow. This is a maritime rug called Marine de Board. This is behind that sort of half wall, a shower and a bathroom. This is looking back the other direction towards the dining space. And so you enter behind that blue colored half wall. And so again, the entrance is very important, that you're kind of shielded. Your view is constricted until you make it from cloak wall, and then you get this sort of full expansive view of the salon and the Mediterranean and the terrace. She's making use of maritime styling, and she's actually using sailcloth on the awnings here, ever hanging from the railing to recall a boat. This is the guest bedroom. Built into the headboard are a nightlight, alarm clock, and sockets for a kettle and a hot water bottle. In the foreground on that very bottom left-hand side, you can see a filing cabinet made out of perforated metal from industrial flour sifters. So she was very much experimenting with new materials at this time. And there's actually, some dispute whether or not Marcel Breuer was really the first one to use chrome. And if you look at some receipts, you can see that she was making lamps using chrome components actually, before Marcel Breuer was doing that. This is a satellite mirror on the left, which has these articulating adjustable arms. So you can make sure that the back of your head looks good too. Actually, researchers don't know what those letters stand for, but obviously they had meanings of what was being stored in those different compartments. These are the night lights on the bottom and this sort of pivoting night table. This is the guest room wardrobe, which I find incredibly chic. I would love to have this wardrobe. And these pivoting drawers that sort of pop out of the corner. And I also find the treatment of the lights very interesting. That she's sort of experimenting with I can't think of the name, but essentially plastic on those ceiling covers. This is the nonconformist armchair, which is what I chose to name the presentation after, which has only one arm. And the idea is that you can be sort of conversational and propped up talking to someone. And she always likes to make variations of her pieces. She never really replicates exactly the same thing twice. So the one for Badavici would be this one, and the one for herself would have had that upholstery coming 3/4 of the way up the arm. So there's always slight different variations of the same furniture piece. Another bibendum chair on the left-hand side after the Michelin Man. This is a trolley on the right that you could carry sort of your pastries or transport the gramophone out onto the deck. This is a tea table on the top left, and that right-hand surface would actually fold down as well. So this is again something meant to be sort of moved around and be incredibly flexible. And on the bottom, a chest of pivoting drawers. And the table that everybody knows, the E1027 adjustable table. So this was originally designed for her sister who enjoyed breakfast in bed. So you can see it there sort of propped over the bedside. An occasional table on the left that's still in production, as well as a dressing table that's in production as well called Petite Coiffeuse. So two versions of a bar stool on the left-hand side. So again, I just find it very interesting that she's determined to make different versions of the same thing. On the right-hand side is an armchair called Transat, which is transatlantic essentially. And it's two wooden two lints that have the upholstery slung between them. This is a day bed, which is still in production as well on the top-hand side. And it's just very often referred to as the Eileen gray day bed. On the bottom, a carpet design, which I find really chic as well and still very timely, I guess, or timeless, I should say. This is a wardrobe made out of cork and aluminum. These are two different versions made for two different places, but one of those was E1027. 1929, Badavici takes an apartment in Paris on Rue Chateaubriand, I'm sorry, again, not a French speaker. And he asks Eileen to transform the small space into a modern studio. So this is very small, 40 square meters, roughly 400 square feet. And she decides to organize this by, on the left-hand side, on that sort of darker shaded area, she's dropping the ceiling down. And then, so again, it's sort of compressing your view upon entering the space. And then once you get out into the main space, you have this sort of decompressive, bigger view. And so she's using sort of metal screens on tracks. You can see that curvy line on the right-hand side in plan, so that you can sort of adjust, again, the sort of walls or the division of these spaces. And in that drop ceiling on the left-hand side, there's storage in the ceiling, essentially. So that sort of like open aperture is actually storage because the space was quite small. And this is a section drawing on the left-hand side of that storage compartment inside of that drop ceiling. And so this is coming out of that drop ceiling area into the bigger space, and you've got another folding screen there on the right-hand side and a small little dining table. And a sort of a central divan. So this is taking the place of a bed and a sofa, essentially, with another adjustable table. And of course, pivoting pivoting tray, and adjustable lights. She also added mirrors to make the space appear larger on the doors of some storage over there, and a work wall as well, and another transat chair. Um, Let me catch up with myself here. Badavici was a heavy drinker and a womanizer, and eventually Eileen tires of his ways and she leaves what she calls all that silliness behind her. And the two split up, but they remain friends for the rest of their lives. Badavici has a new mistress from 1930 to 1946. Her name is Madeline Guassot. Eileen leaves almost all of her belongings behind. She says memories do cling to things, so it is better to start anew. She's always thinking of selling her houses the minute she finishes them. She says, I like doing the things, but I hate possessions. So while building E1027, she had actually purchased a plot of land in Castellar about half an hour away for herself. So I think she kind of knew that E1027 was really never going to be a long-term, was never really a permanent solution, that was finite, that there would be an end to it. And she had already sort of purchased her next move and had an idea of what she was going to do. Um, so she designs another house for herself, and this is a really challenging plot of land because there's existing cisterns on the site already, and there's also a private footpath that runs through the site. So again, she's using all of the context of the site, so you can see she's calling out obviously the direction of the sun, and she's saying the city and the sea are on the left, and on the backhand side are the mountains. And so you can see here very clearly this sort of juxtaposition of new versus old. So these white cement walls are constructed on top of old fountains, essentially old cisterns with those masonry walls. And this is actually a garage door. So there's three cisterns next to each other. That middle one, she turned it into a garage for her car. And it has this pivoting, garage door that we all think of, which is very commonplace today. But at the time was really something different and exciting. And actually, like the children from the village would recall later running up to go see this garage door open. That was quite interesting for its time. This is a model of what that house was originally, what it originally looked like. And you would actually enter on that left-hand side. So you can see this private footpath running through the middle of the site. And you would actually enter on the left, go up that stairwell, and then cross almost like a bridge and enter on that first floor terrace. And this is what that sort of approach looked like, entering the space. And this is looking out from that studio living area towards the terrace. And I really like here as well, you can see there's this little drawer that you can just pull out from that step as well. So again, it's always this clever compositional, everything sort of has a dual purpose or can shift around or transform in some way. This is the work area of that studio living room. So the louvers at the top are adjustable, so you can regulate the amount of light that you're letting into the space. And compared to the furniture of E1027, which was very elegant and sophisticated and very much made for a client, which was John Badavici, he was this editor of a magazine, he was entertaining. This is much more functional. And I think a lot of her later work is focused as well on sort of social needs and making affordable housing and prefabrication and these sort of ideas. So more functional, these new furniture pieces, maybe less refined, a little rougher. So this is an S chair that can essentially fold in half and turn on itself and become almost like this J shape that can become half its size. On the left, this chair becomes a stepladder for accessing storage in the ceiling again. She doesn't like to have personal possessions out on display, so I think there's always this thought about where you store your things as well. And this is a bedroom that has a circuit in the ceiling, which I find really interesting, almost like this eclipse sort of oculus to allow to regulate daylight into the space. Here, a table can be rotated and go from a coffee table height to a dining height, and one side of the tabletop is covered in zinc, and one side is covered in cork. So if you didn't want to have the sort of clatter of dishes or you would use the cork side, and that would sort of, minimize or I guess the acoustical properties are different, obviously. So you'd minimize any clanging of dishes on the cork side. This is the main bedroom with a frame that would have held a mosquito net. And to the right, if you see this very long handle, this very long chrome handle, that's the wardrobe. And so we'll see it from the opposite direction. And that is essentially like an accordion style wardrobe. So you would just pull that open and have access to everything inside of that wardrobe. Very interesting pivoting chest of drawers. And originally, when she finished this, she had called this house La Bateau Blanc, the White Boat. But upon completing it in 1934, she changed the name of it to Tempapaya, which translates to time and straw. So there is a provincial proverb in this region, I suppose, and that translates to with time and straw, the medlars ripen. And medlar is a fruit that has to partially rot before it's actually ripe to eat. So I really love this quote. So it's just alluding to the need for time to elapse for things to mature. So with time and straw, the medlars ripen. Tempapaya is the name of this house. Around the same time of her completing Tempapaya, 1934, Le Corbusier begins regularly visiting Badavici at Vézelay, the place with the pointy roofs that we saw earlier, the old pilgrimage town. The original idea was they were going to try to turn this into an artist colony, which never really came to fruition. But Le Corbusier was very impressed with the work that Badavici had done there, which was very much with Eileen's help. And he published 5 photos of the Vézelay house in his 1935 book, The Radiant City. And he captioned these photos, "Why this astonishing freedom, this sweeping generosity, and this intimacy? There is no longer old or modern. There is what is permanent, the proper measure." In April 1934, Le Corbusier and his artist friend Fernand Léger visit Vézelay together and plan a wall painting in the courtyard. So easel painting becomes bourgeois, and Le Corbusier and Léger want to fuse or integrate artistry and architecture. So they think that they've discovered a new architectural principle of bursting a wall, essentially by painting a mural on it. This is like the modernist fresco, essentially. So Léger, with the help of a local painter, completes this courtyard mural. Léger writes, "The courtyard was enclosed by a wall on which the sun never shone. By applying pure colors and dynamic opposition, the wall became mobile and luminous." And concurrently at the same time, Corbusier begins work on his own mural. This is his first mural on the interior of the double heights, with 2 women bathing is the content of the subject of his mural. And these are by Badavici in an article that is originally titled "The Wall Punctured," but then he later changes the name of the article to "Wall Painting or Spatial Painting." And according to him, this embodies the modern version of the fresco with the ability to burst. And this is what Le Corbusier's mural looks like. So Le Corbusier is invited to E1027 by Badavici in 1938. And in a postcard dated April 28th, he writes to Mademoiselle Gray, noting the rare spirit which dictated all of the arrangements inside and out, and gave to the modern furnishings the equipment, a form so dignified, so charming, so full of wit. So it's clear that he really admires this house and all of the pieces that Eileen had designed. So either before or after this postcard, Badavici invites Le Corbusier to apply this new principle of bursting a wall to E1027. And so these are the 2 murals painted at the time by Le Corbusier inside of E1027. The first one in that main living space, the second one underneath, outside, under the pelotes. So this is the original, what they had published for E1027 on the left-hand side, and this is what that looks like after with Le Corbusier's mural on the right-hand side. 6 months later, Le Corbusier writes to Badavici from a hospital bed in Saint-Tropez. Le Corbusier is a very avid swimmer, and he has a terrible accident. And while swimming from one jetty to another, a speedboat ran over him and put a gash in his head and a huge gash down his leg that we're going to see in a second. And in the letter, Le Corbusier asks Badavici if he'll photograph the 2 murals at E1027. He's really concerned about preserving these murals. He says, please convey once again to Eileen Gray, he spells her name wrong, my thanks for her friendship. So it's possible either that Eileen had visited Le Corbusier in the hospital or that she had responded to an initial postcard. Um, but it's also very clear that Eileen had no knowledge of the murals that were in E1027. So after healing from his injury, Corbusier returns to E1027 in 1939 and paints an additional 5 murals that now total 7 murals in the house. So this is the entrance. So actually in this photo, so Bottavici is on the right-hand side, Le Corbusier is on the left-hand side, and that is Yvonne, which is Le Corbusier's wife, in the middle. And this is the entrance of E1027. So I guess they're dining there. And so Eileen had put that little note that says "Entrez lentement," which is enter slowly, one of these little playful notes that she liked to put, which now has been enveloped by this giant compositional mural. And this is Le Corbusier painting a mural near the guest bedroom downstairs, which no longer exists. And you can see his scar from his boating accident. This is another mural which no longer exists today, which was behind a sort of sliding shutter at the entrance. Another mural in the guest bedroom, and another mural in the dining room. Bottavici initially praised these murals, saying in 1941 how resplendent they were. And there's a quote that says, "It's funny how well paintings go with the shack and the sea. Hats off to Corbu and 1,000 thanks." During World War II, these were actually, the house was occupied by German soldiers and the murals were used as target practice, which later Eileen would find very amusing. So Eileen spends the first year of World War II in Castellar, but as the Germans advance, the area is ordered to move inland, especially because she's not a French citizen. She is Irish. She's a foreigner still. She's cut off from her work, which she notes is the only thing worth staying alive for. And finally, after the Germans retreated, she and 3 friends took the train to Menton and returned back to Castellar. And everything had been looted, everything had been destroyed of Castellar, of Tampapaya, down to the mirrors, china, and clothing. Drawings had been used to start theirs. Eileen commented the Germans not only wrecked the house, but cut down all of the trees. She retreated to her flat in Paris, which thankfully had not been touched. And in 1946, she very slowly began to renovate Castellar, which took her 7 years to do. And her eyesight started to deteriorate as well, at which point she didn't feel comfortable driving. And eventually she sells to Tampapaya to a painter. It seems that Eileen found out about the murals and E1027 only after they were published, which is in 1948-49. In one publication, Corbu noted that the surfaces he painted on were dull, sad walls where nothing was happening. Another photo was captioned, "The mural paintings brightened only the unpleasing walls of the house. The good walls remained white." And really the insult here is that he never credited the architecture to Eileen Gray. So from this point forward, everyone assumes that the house is either designed by Le Corbusier himself or by Bottavici. And Eileen is sort of written out of the architectural history at this point. And she's very reclusive, and she's not going to stand up for herself. And she's kind of in this self-imposed reclusiveness also. In 1949, this led to an angry exchange of letters between Bottavici and Corbu. It's very possible that Eileen put Bottavici up to standing up for herself, I guess. And so Bottavici and Le Corbusier have an argument. And Bottavici accuses him of using E1027 as a laboratory and sacrificing the profound sense of an intellectual approach, which completely banned painting being pure functional architecture. Eileen later in life would say that she very much enjoyed Le Corbusier's work. She had a lot of respect for him, but I think she never really forgave this intrusion onto her place that she had designed. 1949, Le Corbusier leaves E1027 in this argument with Bottavici and goes up the steps back towards the train station. And it is the first day of business for a restaurant that's directly on top of E1027. And this restaurant is called L'Etoile de Mer. Le Corbusier befriends the owner, Thomas Robitato. And he convinces the owner, Mr. Robitato, to in exchange for designing some summer hostels, essentially, to give Corbusier a little plot of land. And Corbusier would build himself a little cabanon, a little place to live for he and his wife. And so this is Corbusier's cabanon, which is just a few hundred feet away from E1027. And this is the entrance of E1027 with those sort of summer hostels. In 1956, Badavici writes to Eileen to come quickly, that he's diagnosed with liver cancer, being a heavy drinker had taken its toll, and that he's dying, and she races to Monaco to be at his side while he's dying. Badavici had lived with another woman for many years, but it's actually Eileen who arranges his funeral. And there's a journal entry from Eileen that says, at this time, saw Le Corbusier, but it doesn't mention specifics. It's possible that they had discussed the fate of E1027. She had wanted it back and very much saw it as her own. But legally, this is Badavici's property. She had purchased this in his name. And he told Eileen that he'd meant to leave a will, but he never did. So Badavici dies. And legally, E1027 passes to Badavici's next of kin, which is his sister, who is a nun who is still living in Romania. And because of her religious establishment, she's not allowed to own property either. His house goes up for sale by a representative for the state of Romania. And at one point, there's sort of like an auction, I guess, and there's an attempt to sell it to Aristotle Onassis. And Le Corbusier intervenes and tells a friend of his, a Swiss doctor, to get on a train and to bring all of the cash she can find in a hat, and to come to the seaside. And so Le Corbusier is very much preoccupied with preserving his own murals there, and convinces his friend to purchase this. And so the house becomes owned by Madame Shelbert, who didn't know who Eileen Gray was, and she only knew that it was important because Le Corbusier had said it was important. And I believe at one point she had tried to throw out some of the furnishings, and he actually intervened and said, "Stop! You should keep those. Those are important." She didn't really know what she had. She removed the canvas awning. She put up drapes and Venetian blinds on the south window. So this is actually what that looked like, I believe, in the 70s at this time. In 1965, while swimming in the waters below E1027, Le Corbusier has a massive heart attack in the water and dies. There's at the very top of the hill, there's a memorial for he and his wife. And it's very possible that E1027 is the last thing that he ever saw. In 1974, Madame Shelbert gives her doctor the right to take over the property upon her death. And so she actually leaves E1027 to her gynecologist, whose name is Mr. Peter Kagi. And she continues to live until 1982, which is when Dr. Kagi takes over the property. And Dr. Kagi has a drug habit, and it is said that E1027 becomes a den of drug-fueled orgies. In 1991, he sold most of the furniture under the pretense he was going to use the proceeds to restore the villa, which he never did. And in 1996, he is stabbed to death in the living room by vagrants. The assailants said they were hired to do cleaning work and killed Mr. Kagi when he refused to pay them. So he bled out in this living room. I'm sorry if you can hear my phone going off. For several years, the home is taken over by squatters and vandalized. In the year 1999, E1027 is officially purchased by the government and classified as a National Historic Monument, ironically, in part because of the murals of Le Corbusier. And this is E1027 restored as it stands today. Eileen never returned to E1027 after leaving. She lived in the Rue Bonaparte apartment for the rest of her life. And from World War II onward, she is very reclusive and withdrawn, largely living a life of obscurity. This is the inside of her apartment in the Rue Bonaparte. I'm going to breeze through this. We're almost done. These are 2 brick screens. And she made 10 over the total course of her life, and the last one was a bright red one in the 1970s. Around 1965, Joseph Weichert, who is an architectural historian, is interviewing an artist named Prunella Clough, who is the niece of Eileen Gray, and she asks if he is familiar with the work of her aunt, and he responds that he's not, and she brings out the portfolio of E1027, and he had no idea that she was still alive or even that she was the architect, and so they go to visit her the next time they're both in Paris. And he publishes an article in 1968 about her work and brings her to the attention of the world again. In 1972, there's a small exhibition of her work put on by the Royal Institute of British Architects in London. The same year, one of her initial screens went up for auction and was sold for $36,000, which she thought was just a crazy amount of money that someone would want to pay for her work. In 1973, after viewing the Reba exhibition, Gray is approached by Ziv Aram, who owns a furniture store, and they work on prototyping many of her pieces together. And this is who licensed Classicon for those products, which are still in production. And she still wants to make adjustments 50 years later. She still wants to make 2 centimeters bigger or whatever for the Bibendum chair. She works until the very end in 1976. She sends her housekeeper to buy wood for a tabletop for a new project, and she falls and dies several days later in a hospital. Her funeral at Père Lachaise Cemetery was attended by 3 people: her housekeeper, her niece, and her biographer, Peter Adam. Her grave plot was not renewed in 1998, and her ashes were scattered in a communal garden in a suburban cemetery named Thigh Cemetery. The dragon's armchair that we initially saw, and that initially would have been a pale salmon fabric that was designed for Madame Levy, was acquired by a Parisian art dealer who then in turn sold it to Yves Saint Laurent in 1973. And this is the crowds lined up for blocks to see the items on view at the Grand Palais for the Yves Saint Laurent estate sale in 2009. And the chair had a pre-auction estimate of 2 to 3 million euros. And it sold for 21,905,000 euros and becomes the most expensive piece of 20th century decorative art ever sold at auction. Today, most of Eileen Gray's designs are manufactured under licensed by Aram through Classicon, headquartered in Munich, and with many dealers throughout the world, like Shop in Houston, Texas. So that's pretty much it. That's everything I have. And I think we're right on the money with timing. So thank you so much for attending. And I don't know if anybody has any questions. I don't know if I can turn it back over to Julia. Or can you take control?
From you.
Okay. All right.
Everybody, thank you guys so much for joining us. Let me see if I can I take it back from you? I swear. Well, it doesn't matter, but thank you guys so much for joining us. We really appreciate you taking time out of your day. And now I can't see everybody. There we go. And if you have any questions, please reach out to Adam and myself. I emailed everybody earlier this morning, and he's on that email. So go ahead and shoot us those, and then make sure you send us an email with your accreditation registration numbers. That way we can get you guys done, certified.
IDCE number, then I can get you credit on my end. And if not, then I can give you an IDCEC certificate that you can self-report either to AIA or to whichever accrediting body you would like.
Yes. Awesome. Well, again, thank y'all for joining us. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks for coming. Thank you.
Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.